Somewhere along the way, imagination stopped being treated as essential and started being treated as optional, as something we grow out of, something impractical. But what if imagination is not an escape from the reality, but one of the most powerful ways that we make sense of it, right? So, hey, dear listeners, welcome back to another powerful episode of Mind Meets Machine. I'm your host, Avik, and it is a podcast where we explore how human creativity, meaning, and the inner worlds evolve in a time shaped by the technology and the speed. And today's guest, please welcome Christopher Kaufman. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Avik. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for joining us today. And dear listeners, before we delve deep into our discussion today, I'll quickly love to introduce you with Christopher. So Christopher is a composer, fantasy author, visual artist, and the storyteller. So he is the creator of the epic fantasy series, Tales of the Ocean City, and upcoming podcast, The Fantastic World of Christopher Kaufman, which brings fantasy stories to life through the narration, cinematic, symphonic music, and sound design. And in this episode, dear listeners, I would love to say that we will be exploring the transformative power of imagination, like why it matters more than ever, and at the same time, how art helps us reclaim the parts of ourselves that the modern life often erodes. So I'll not take much of your time. Let's get started. Welcome to the show again.
Thank you.
Amazing. And Christopher, you started creating the fantasy stories and the illustrations at 9, and then later immersed yourself in the music. It's quite a journey, right? So I'm very curious, when you look back then, did imagination ever feel like a kind of phase, or did it always feel like a core part of who you are?
I would say the latter, yes. It always felt like a core part of who I am as
Exactly.
First a young person and then a creative artist, so the illusion was perfectly aligned to just continue.
And that continuity is definitely striking because many people lose touch with that part of themselves. And when we talk about that part of losing it, right? So a lot of adults hear these words like fantasy and the imagination, and they assume it kind of escapism, right? So something disconnected from the real life. So what do you think people misunderstood most about the imagination?
There's a couple of different ways of talking about it. One is, first you could take the words and thoughts of J.R. Tolkien on that matter. And he said, well, of course it's an escape. If you were in a prison, like a war, situation, you were a war prisoner, you would be honor bound to escape and take as many people with you as you can.
Correct.
Whereas Lloyd Alexander, another of my favorite writers, he says very clearly that imagination, fantasy, science fiction, fantasy is all metaphor. It's metaphor for our lives, for us. Different kinds of characters and creatures are personifications of different parts of our humanity. And by putting them there, we can talk about them. What are orcs? They're our shadow selves, the shadow of the good parts of us. And so we can internalize that. And by experiencing the defeat of those creatures through this massive epic, we feel it in ourselves and we undergo a bit of that transformation. And then we can identify what is the part of our life that we want to defeat. And then we can feel, I've done this myself where I'll just, I'm going into a room and have to speak to everyone and I'm feeling a little nervous. Well, I'll feel one of my characters from my books and I'll imbue that in myself and it'll help give me the courage and power to speak. And people can do that with any of their favorite characters that they take into themselves, and then personify, and then it just helps us grow our personalities. But, mythology goes way back to the roots of our civilizations, of all of our civilizations. And there were imaginative stories which teach all kinds of lessons and give us examples on how to conquer problems and all like that. For example, I was mentioning The Lord of the Rings. Well, he felt that it should be read as if it really happened years ago, and we're reading a real mythology. That's how you should read it and experience it, and you take it in yourself. And so all of these characters can be different parts of our own humanity. And in science fiction, the same thing. The aliens, and Ender's Game of Orson Scott Card, the buggers they were called, they were like the shadow humanity. And by placing them there and having the opposing forces and the dialogue that occurs between the different elements which are placed into this imaginative world, well, you can talk about our lives. And of course, one of the greatest examples of that is the work of Ursula Le Guin, who very specifically took up society's issues and placed them in her books and spoke about them. So that
Exactly.
is what it's about. Besides just reawakening your own imaginative self for your own self inside your personality and your life. So our lives are a little grayer now. There's these artificial lights, and
Yeah.
what was once a beautiful Eden of forestry is now a parking lot, and we live in little boxes and we watch the television is doing it all for us. Our imaginations are degraded. And the more they're degraded, the less we can envision for ourselves. Our critical thinking is degraded along with it. So many things about our own human evolution. So by reawakening that, you're not being a child. You're being, well, there might be certain things from your childhood that are great that you want to reawaken that you shouldn't have closed off. But also it's within you and your adult self and your future. So you can reignite things that had been dormant by experiencing the powerful fantasy stories. I mean, look at Beowulf.
Yeah.
Beowulf is this massive thing, and the Grendel who lives in the murk. I used to teach one-on-one young people who are like in trouble. They called
Okay.
them challenged youth, which is an unfortunate term, but that's what they called them. So I would
Mm.
go out to little Anthony's house
Okay.
once a week, and he lived on the outskirts of Ithaca, New York, in what was called a double wide, which is, very impoverished circumstances. And the doctors had, like, they didn't know what was wrong with him. They couldn't really, he was sickly and they didn't know why. It might have just been simply malnutrition. They assigned it all these different names. Well, I was just going out there to work with him. I was like the liaison. I would work with him and then take his work to school and pick up the,
Right.
like the bridge, I would advocate for the schools with him and I would advocate for him with the schools. Anyway, we did out loud, he's like a middle schooler, but we did Beowulf. And we read it to each other. And at the end of each chapter, I would say, okay, write it, answer these questions. And at the end of the whole thing, the story of the Grendel and his swamp, and Beowulf goes down into the swamp and fights this deep, sick monster, right? Well, at the end of it, I said, okay, you are Grendel, right.
Yeah.
And at the end of it, he went back to school and they said, what happened to this kid? He's like my best student now. Before I worked, I don't mean to take credit, but he was having trouble with the alphabet. And they said
Okay.
he can't learn. And at the end of it, he's doing Beowulf. And he says he wanted to be a pathologist because the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him.
Mm.
Right. So there's a really nice example of how this fantasy epic transformed a young person's life. So we can all do that to our various levels in our lives as we go along.
Exactly. And I have to say, this actually reframes the imagination as as a nourishment and not the avoidance.
Exactly.
Right.
Nourishment.
Yeah.
I have one of my books, The Fantastic Zoo, where children go into the Fantastic Zoo and experience the
Okay.
stories of the phoenix, the mermaid, and the dragon. And it's really interesting you said that, because before each of these powerful, amazing beings tell their story to the children, they say, I would be happy to tell you, children, my story, so you may be nourished by it. So you nailed it there. And that's the exact word I used each time the being, the personification, told its story.
Hmm. That's amazing, I have to say. And if I have to ask, like, when imagination is underfed, right? So how do you see that playing out in people's emotional lives, like creativity or even their sense of meaning?
Well, it can just be simple, like a feeling of dullness or grayness,
Okay.
blissness. It can be depression, and it can be worse, because if you don't have a connection to your imagination and how you see life. I mean, when you really imbibe the great fantasy stories like Lord of Dunsany or Tolkien or anybody, maybe even my work, you see the world and hear the world differently. You see, your imagination makes stories out of everything you see. I mean, you could be walking down next to one of those parking lots I mentioned that was once a beautiful forest, and now is black tar. And you see a little flower growing through the cracks.
Okay.
Well, that flower is on a quest to regain that forest. It remembers when it and its friends, fed little buzzing creatures all around. And it was a glorious, beautiful piece of life right there, right? So you can just see all kinds of things like that as you walk. And that doesn't mean you're insane and believe them, but your imagination wakes up for you. And then you can fit yourself into your own imaginative construct and see what you might do in the future. What's your quest? What are your goals? You can do them just like Frodo and Sam did, onwards. And it's different for everyone. Might have a completely different. I'm using Lord of the Rings a lot because it's on my mind,
Okay.
but it could be a lot of different stories. Whatever. I would suggest that people reawaken maybe their favorite story from when they were young to start off there.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. And obviously, that explains why so many people feel dull or disconnected without knowing why. Definitely. So, when someone enters a world like Tales of the Ocean City, with the music, narration, and sound design, what tends to happen inside them that does not happen with faster and more passive media?
Well, my pieces, I was, as you mentioned before, I used to write stories with illustrations like 9, and then I went to the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts and found music and lived the life of a composer for many years, all the way through my doctorate in music composition from Cornell University, and I studied all these famous composers, and I continue my concert music career. When I had achieved my goals there with the degrees, but the stories never left me. So when I go to sleep at night, I'm always thinking about them. So I emerged at the same time, the degrees and the complete event structure for Tales of the Ocean City all the way through book 8, which I'm finishing now, finally. And so when I got to writing the book down, writing it, it didn't quite happen until I started combining it with the music. Then live narration helped me form the words and express the voice of the writing and the music. And I composed them all at the same time. Sometimes I felt like the text was accompanying the music. The music is really important. It gives all this emotional power and depth. And so you put it all together and you get a pretty strong, immersive storytelling experience. And then, of course, there are books with visual art in them, but just the sound is enough. And that was very fulfilling and creative for me. And I hear people experience that energy and joy I had of creating it in their experience of it. So do you want to go to an example now?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So very quickly, Tales of the Ocean City is the story of a young civilization turning the corner to the future. But first they must face an enemy from the deep past called the Vorm. It goes all the way back to their origin story. Now, the book, though, here starts with young Harloot and Vespucian, the main characters. He's a young man, and Vespucian is a Parianth, which is a kind of telepathic Pegasus. And they're bonded like family. They're very close, and they speak telepathically, mind to each other. Innocently enough, at the beginning, he's just playing in the ocean. They're flying, and he's going over the southern plain to join more fully in the city life of the Ocean City. He sees the princess and her Parianth bond, as they're called, and they're flying over the plain peacefully as well. He's going to go say hello, and pow! They are attacked by these Vorm warriors. And the whole first book, which is called Battle in the Sky, is this 40-minute, visceral, beautiful, amazing, fun battle scene. The conflict and resolution aspect is very powerful. And at the ending of the book is extremely high energy and positive, but they have all this fighting enemy. So the excerpt you're going to see now is episode 3 from book 1. And it's when the Vorm attack, they use a psychic kind of scream that numbs Harloot, and Vespucian has just gone into a cloud, to wait for him to come back while Brian Lynn is battling these monsters. All right. And so this episode is when he wakes up and they join in the fight.
So, and that immersion feels almost like a forgotten muscle being reactivated, right? If you talk about the creation, if you talk
Pardon?
about the creation, so
How I made it?
yes,
Okay, well, I have a program called Logic, which is very
okay,
common for music users and composers and film.
mhm,
And I actually have, I've set scores to some films and stuff, indie
okay,
films and such. So I have this technology in my home lab, as I call it, where I am now. And so I was recording the narration and then bringing it over and composing the music right into Logic with my Vienna symphonic libraries and symphonic libraries, So I'm composing on my keyboard, and it's orchestra music, and I'm working with it and doing them both at the same time. And so, in fact, there'd be times in the middle of that book where I hadn't written the end yet, and it occurred to me while I was doing the middle and scribbled all over the pages very excitedly and funnily. So that was basically how it was created. But, it took years of making a composer out of myself first, and having the story all completely in my head, all the event structure, and then writing it out, and then doing it live, and then rewriting it as I spoke it, so the sound of the words affected how the language came about.
exactly, understood. Yep. And for someone who says that I'm not an artist, but how can they begin feeding their imagination into a kind of again in small and realistic ways?
You're saying, how would a person who's not a creative artist engage in things? Well, there's many things you can do. I have friends who did things like they were retired and they started playing cello. The cello is one of the easier ones because you don't have to hold it like a violin. You just play it and you just stroke, and you get this beautiful sound that makes your whole body vibrate. All you have to do is stroke one sound, and you're getting something immediately. And you have a good teacher who can help you, and then you can play simple songs. You can improvise, and there you go in music. That's one way. Or keyboard, the same kind of thing. If you have a teacher, I've taught many adults, and I teach children too and adults, and I have them composing and creating right off the bat, so they don't have to have a degree in order to compose. You can just if you do it right, you can have them improvising, composing in their third lesson. So musically, that's one way. Another would be art classes, drawing, reading. Everyone has their own talent. It's probably something they did years ago, perhaps, or just last week, but they stopped, or, it just fell out of their life. So that's one way to start, is something you've already done, right? And there's all kinds of people and online things where you can find teachers who work with people who are not majors or professionals in that subject for all kinds of things. So you can avail yourself of it. First thing to do is to try to just get something going, re-evoke, hopefully something you've already done, maybe in the deep past or thought of doing and then didn't do. That thing where you imagine yourself doing it and you just don't quite get there. Well, go ahead and give it a shot, and don't be intimidated. Don't feel like it has to be at a certain level to start. Let yourself just draw a line and color it, and on you go.
Agree, totally agree. And because this removes the pressure and brings it back to the curiosity and play. Yeah. And in a world increasingly shaped by machines and the automations, what role do you believe that imagination plays that technology simply cannot replace?
Well, technology doesn't have imagination.
Yeah.
Now, it took imagination to create it. Like science fiction writers, have sown the seeds for many things we have now, or maybe even all of them. You talk about Star Trek and the phone, stuff like that, but iPads. So that in itself cancels itself out.
Hmm.
I don't think, the machinery has imagination. So that's our permanent human advantage. Certain tasks that, that the machines can take over theoretically would leave you free to do other things. But, there's freedom is based on economy in our life. So
Hmm.
you have to figure that out, but not get lost in it if you can.
Exactly.
All you got to do is earn a little bit more than you need and you're free, right?
True. True. That's a powerful distinction, I would say, because machines can generate, but they do not dream. Exactly. So, for someone who is listening who feels disconnected from wonder, meaning, or kind of inner depth, then what would you gently invite them to remember about the imagination?
That is yours. It's your own personal inner
Hmm.
world that we're talking about that, no one else can say anything about other than to help you develop it and grow it and to do that. But sometimes I advise people, they might reawaken. I have a blog called The Power of Fantasy, which you can find at thefantasypower.com. In it, I
Okay.
talk about these things. And in my upcoming podcast, which I hope to get up February 1st or so, it starts with ongoing episodes from Tales of the Ocean City. But then the second half of the episode, it's like a free form, of writings about fantasy. And I write about authors and writings from my blog. And one of them is called The Reawakening, and it talks about exactly what we've been talking about. And I advise people, look, if
Okay.
you get things going, you don't have to share it with everyone because you don't want people to downgrade it. You don't want to get
Hmm.
shot down. Keep it as your own private world. Share it with, well, you could go to my blog and share it with anyone there who are like-minded. And I keep it safe. I monitor it so no one can say mean things. And you can find tribesmen, tribespeople. It can be a friend or a person on a blog or a child or a parent. It could be somebody you know. So you can form your tribe of like-minded people who you feel safe sharing these things with. But mostly it's for you. It's inside yourself. So it can be a protected place, like a refuge. It's another, we talked about fantasy as escape, fantasy as metaphor, just the power of gods, and it's
Yeah.
also a refuge, a safe place to be yourself.
Amazing. Like, imagination is obviously, I would love to say, dear listeners, that imagination is not a kind of luxury. It is a vital force that helps us remember that who we are and who we might become.
Exactly.
Right. So, Christopher, like, where can listeners explore your work and learn more about Tales of the Ocean City and your upcoming podcast?
Well, there's a direct website, talesoftheoceancity.com, where it's all there. You can see and read and listen and check things out, acquire things. My podcast, The Fantastic Worlds of Christopher Kaufman, that's with a PH, the fantastic worlds, phantasmagoria, let me say. The word phantasmagoria, that's why I use that with the PH,
Okay.
is a musical term, which means imagination in arts. So the fantastic worlds of Christopher Kaufman. And that'll come up soon. I'm preparing. I want to get like a number of episodes ready before I start, so I can always be
Okay.
ahead of myself. So
Understood.
I'm close to that. So a couple of weeks, it'll be out.
Perfect.
And I also have a YouTube channel, Sound Artist. That's Sound Art Us, US, Sound Artus. And it's YouTube. And on there, different playlists. There's the Fantastic Theater, which is all kinds of movies and episodes and examples of works, live works, stage works, theatrical works. And there's also examples of my books, the book trailers, stuff like that. And there's concerts with live concert music, performances of my work and stuff like that. You see me conducting and all that kind of thing. So there, if you want to investigate my just home site, to see the whole everything that I do, it's soundartist.com. Again, soundartus. And that's my home site. And there's menu buttons for the Fantastic Theater and the author, which will take you to see all kinds of stuff. And feel free to just explore.
Amazing. So, dear listeners, what I'll do is I'll put all the links into the show notes for your easy reference. And if this conversation stirred something in you, here's a simple invitation, I'd say. Make space this week for a story, a piece of music, or an image that slows you down and opens something inside. So thank you so much for listening to Mind Meets Machine. And if this episode resonated, share it with someone who could use a little more wonder in their life. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Loved it. Thank you.